The stage line out of Yuma ran 3 times a week, and on the morning of September the 4th, 1883, it carried 6 passengers west across the desert floor toward the small ranching settlement of Gila Bend, Arizona Territory. Willa Ashford sat nearest the window on the right side of the coach, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape with the particular stillness of someone who had already done all the deciding that needed to be done. She was 24 years old. She had brown hair pinned back under a practical bonnet the color of old straw, and green eyes that took in everything without giving much back. Her traveling dress was dark gray wool, brushed clean but showing its age at the cuffs and collar. She carried 2 carpet bags and a small trunk that had seen better decades, and in the pocket of her dress she kept a single folded letter, the paper soft from handling. She did not take the letter out again. She had read it enough times to know it by heart. The handwriting was careful and even, the sentences plain and direct, the kind of letter written by a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chose his wood, for function rather than decoration. His name was Everett Calhoun. He ran a cattle operation outside Gila Bend. He was 28 years old. He had described his circumstances honestly and without embellishment, which was the thing that had made Willa write back. She had answered 4 other letters before his. The first man had described himself as a prosperous landowner and turned out, after 2 exchanges, to mean that he had once owned land. The second had sent a daguerreotype that did not appear to be of himself. The third had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly dull in a way that made Willa feel she would disappear entirely within 6 months. The fourth had mentioned, in his third letter and almost as an aside, that he had a temper but was working on it. Everett Calhoun had written, "I will not pretend this is a romantic arrangement. I need a partner who is willing to work hard and to share in building something that does not yet exist in its finished form. I believe in being direct about what I am asking for, because I would rather a woman know the truth of it before she agrees than feel deceived after she arrives." That sentence had decided it for Willa. She had been living for 14 months in the spare bedroom of her late husband's cousin's house in Philadelphia, a narrow room with a window that faced a brick wall and a door that was never quite closed all the way, as if leaving it slightly open was a reminder that she was a guest and not a resident. Her husband, George Ashford, had been dead for 16 months. He had been a kind man, genuinely kind. The sort of quiet and steady kindness that does not announce itself. He had also been a man who believed that things would work out, that the notes he had co-signed would be settled, that the investments would recover, that there was no situation so difficult that patience and goodwill could not eventually resolve it. Willa had loved him for that quality, and watched it ruin him and grieved him with a complexity that she had never been able to explain to anyone who asked. Because how do you mourn a man and simultaneously mourn the life he left behind him, the bills that arrived in his name, the creditors who came to the door with a patience that was nothing like his, the cousin's wife who said, "Of course you must stay, of course," while her eyes said something entirely different. So when the Philadelphia correspondent for a Western matrimonial agency had placed a small notice in the paper seeking women of good character and sound constitution willing to consider relocation to the Arizona Territory, Willa had torn the notice out carefully and kept it in her pocket for 3 weeks before writing. Outside the coach window, the desert unreeled in long flat stretches of sandy earth and low scrub, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings the color of old rust. The sky was enormous, a deep, clear blue with no clouds at all, and the sun fell straight down onto everything without mercy. Two of the other passengers had complained about the heat within the first hour out of Yuma. Willa had looked at the landscape and thought that it was honest, at least. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. The coach swayed and jolted. The axle groaned over a rough patch of road. Willa watched a hawk circle high above the canyon rim to the north and thought about what Everett Calhoun's ranch house would look like. Whether she would have her own room at first, as he had promised in his last letter. Whether the kitchen would be functional, or whether she would be starting from the bare bones of a bachelor's neglect. She was not afraid of the bare bones. She had been managing bare bones for the better part of 2 years. What she was, she had admitted to herself somewhere in the long rocking hours between Tucson and Yuma, was tired. Not frightened, not uncertain. Just tired in a way that lived underneath her ribs and had been there so long she sometimes forgot it was separate from herself. She pressed her lips together and looked back at the desert. They stopped at a way station to change horses and take on water. A low adobe building with a single cottonwood tree providing a small island of shade. Willa climbed down to stretch her legs and stood in the thin shadow of the eave, drinking from the tin cup a weathered woman offered to each passenger in turn. That was where she first saw the dog. It appeared from around the back corner of the way station, a smallish creature of perhaps 3 or 4 months old, with floppy ears too large for its head and a coat of brown and white that was matted past any reasonable state of cleanliness. Its ribs showed. One of its back paws was slightly turned, though it walked without any apparent difficulty. Its tail, however, was moving with a velocity entirely at odds with the rest of its condition, wagging so hard that its entire hindquarters swung back and forth, and its eyes, dark brown and very direct, were fixed on Willa with an expression of absolute and uncomplicated certainty. She looked down at it. It looked up at her. One of the other passengers, the heavy-set man in the brown coat who had not stopped complaining since Tucson, made a sound of mild disgust. Filthy thing. Probably diseased. Willa crouched down and held out the back of her hand. The dog crept forward, sniffed with enormous care, and then licked her knuckles with such concentrated gratitude that Willa felt something shift unexpectedly behind her sternum. She stroked the dog's head once. The dog pressed into her hand and closed its eyes. The driver called the 5-minute warning. Willa stood. The dog stood with her, its eyes following her every movement. When she walked to the coach and climbed back up the step, the dog trotted behind her and then, before anyone thought to stop it, scrambled up into the coach behind her and sat down between her feet, as though it had always been there and was simply returning to its customary place. The heavy-set man said something sharp. The driver leaned in from outside and asked whose dog it was. Nobody claimed it. Nobody knew where it had come from. The way station woman, when consulted, said she had seen it hanging around for 2 or 3 days and thought it belonged to a family that had passed through heading east, though she could not be certain. Willa looked down at the dog sitting between her feet, its tail still moving, its eyes still fixed on her. She said quietly, "It can ride with me." There was a brief debate between the driver and the heavy-set man that Willa did not participate in. She simply sat with her hands folded and waited for the conversation to resolve itself, which it did, eventually, in her favor. The dog stayed. For the remaining 2 hours into Gila Bend, it did not move from her feet except once, briefly, to put its head on her knee. She placed her hand on its head without looking down, and it settled there like something that had been searching for a long time and had finally stopped, Gila Bend in September of 1883 was a town that made no particular attempt to be impressive. Its main street was a single dirt road lined with sun-faded wooden buildings, and the afternoon light hit everything at a flat, hard angle that left no shadows to soften the edges. There was a general store, a livery, a small church with a bell that was apparently used for purposes other than Sunday service, a saloon whose sign had lost 2 of its 4 letters to weather, and a boarding house run by a woman named Harriet Yowell, who was standing on the porch of that establishment with her arms folded when the coach rolled in, and who, Willa would later come to understand, was standing on that porch most times the coach rolled in, as she considered it her personal responsibility to know what arrived in Gila Bend before it had time to cause surprises. Harriet Yowell was a woman somewhere in her middle 50s with iron gray hair, a face that had been weathered by 20 years of desert sun into something that resembled carved wood in the best possible way, and a manner that was brisk without being unkind. She watched the passengers disembark with the professional assessment of someone who had seen a great many things come off that coach and had learned to identify which category of situation she was looking at within the first 30 seconds. Willa climbed down last, carrying her carpet bag in one hand and holding the door for the dog with the other. The dog jumped down, stumbled, righted itself, and then pressed its side against Willa's ankle. Harriet Yowell looked at the woman, looked at the dog, looked at the woman again, and then looked at the man standing near the hitching post on the near side of the road, who had been there when the coach arrived and who had not moved since, and who was holding the brim of his hat in both hands with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with his hands. His name was Everett Calhoun. He was taller than Willa had pictured from the letters, lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, all function and no extra. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that had been shaved that morning with some care, and he was wearing a dark blue cotton shirt that had been ironed, which she somehow noticed immediately, the way you notice the particular effort behind a thing when it is not the person's habit. His boots were clean. His hat, currently held in both hands, was not a new hat, but it was a good one. He looked at her with brown eyes that were measuring and careful and not unfriendly, though not warm either, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Willa had rehearsed nothing. She had decided, somewhere on the long road from Philadelphia, that rehearsing was a form of hoping for a specific outcome, and that hoping for a specific outcome was a luxury she could not currently afford. So she simply stood in the September sun of Gila Bend and looked at Everett Calhoun, and waited. He looked at her. He looked at the dog at her feet. He looked back at her. He said, "I am Everett Calhoun." She said, "I know. I am Willa Ashford." There was a pause. The dog sat down on Willa's foot. Everett looked at it again. His expression was difficult to read, which she would come to understand was simply how his face worked. Not unfriendliness, but a kind of natural economy. He said, "That your dog?" Willa considered the question. She said, "It followed me from the way station. I did not invite it, but I could not leave it." His ribs were showing. A brief silence, then, "It's a her. I have not had the opportunity to determine that yet." Something moved in his expression that might, in a different man, have become a smile. It did not quite become one, but it moved in that direction. He put his hat back on and said, "I have a wagon. Your things are the 2 bags in the trunk?" "Yes." He moved to collect them without being asked, lifting them with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to hauling things considerably heavier. Willa watched him and did not offer to help, not because she was unable, but because he had already established a clear intention, and interfering with it would only slow them both down. Harriet Yoel had descended from the porch and arrived at Willa's elbow with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent decades navigating situations that require immediate practical management. She said, "I am Harriet Yoel. I run the boarding house. You must be the young woman Everett has been expecting." Willa said, "I am." Harriet looked her over with a directness that was not rude, but was thorough, the way a doctor looks at a patient, gathering information without judgment. Then she nodded, as though she had reached a satisfactory conclusion, and said, "You look capable. That is the important thing, out here. Pretty fades in about 6 months with this son. Capable keeps." Willa said, "I will take that as a compliment." Harriet smiled briefly. It was intended as one. The wagon was a buckboard, practical and not new, hitched to 2 patient-looking bay horses that stood with their heads lowered against the heat. Everett had loaded the bags and trunk and was standing beside the wagon when Willa and Harriet arrived. He looked at the dog, which had not left Willa's immediate vicinity, and said, "It cannot ride on the seat." Willa said, "She can ride in the back." He looked at her steadily. She held his gaze without difficulty. Another thing she had learned in Philadelphia was that most people who established rules in the first 5 minutes of an acquaintance were establishing them because they were worried about something. And what they were usually worried about was that they were not in control of the situation. She did not intend to take control of anything that belonged to Everett Calhoun. She simply intended to not be pushed around in the first hour of an acquaintance she would be living inside for the foreseeable future. He said, "Fine." She rides in the back. Willa lifted the dog, which submitted to this with quiet dignity, and settled her in the bed of the wagon among the bags and a coil of rope and a folded tarp. The dog turned around twice and lay down with her chin on the edge of the tarp and her eyes on Willa. Harriet said to Everett, "You will bring her to church Sunday, I expect." Everett said, "I expect so." Harriet said to Willa, "The women's circle meets Thursday evenings. You are welcome when you are settled." She paused. Then, "Everett is a good man. He does not always show it in ways that are easy to read. But he is," Willa said. "Thank you for telling me." Harriet looked at her again with that careful directness. Then she nodded and went back to her porch. The drive out to the ranch took just under an hour. The road left the main street of Gila Bend and headed northeast through open desert country, rising gradually onto a broad plain where the scrub grew taller and the rocky ridges to the north showed more clearly against the sky. Everett drove without speaking, which Willa did not find uncomfortable. She had spent enough time in the company of people who spoke in order to fill silence, rather than to say something that she had come to find genuine quiet a form of courtesy. She watched the landscape. The colors were extraordinary, reds and ochres and the silvered green of sage, all of it thrown into hard relief by the afternoon sun. A dust devil moved across the flat ground to their left, traveling fast and then collapsing into nothing. Somewhere behind them, the dog shifted in the wagon bed and resettled. After perhaps 20 minutes, Everett said, "I want to be straight with you about the ranch." She said, "All right, the house is sound. I built it myself. Adobe and timber. It keeps out the heat reasonably well and the roof does not leak. The kitchen is functional. There are 2 bedrooms. The second one is yours. I had a mattress brought out last week from the general store." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I am not in a position to offer you much in the way of luxury. I want you to know that before we get there, So there are no surprises. I did not come expecting luxury. He glanced at her sideways. What did you come expecting? She considered the question seriously. She said, honest work and honest dealing. That is what your letter offered. I did not need anything else in the offering. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my letter said the arrangement was practical in nature. She said, yes. He said, I meant that. I did not write it to be cold. I wrote it because I thought a woman deserved to know what she was coming to. I understood it that way. Another silence, longer this time. The horses moved at a steady walk. The desert light was beginning to change as the afternoon lengthened, the shadows stretching out from the east, the color of the sand shifting from bleached white to something warmer. He said, the dog cannot sleep in the house. She said, that seems premature, given that we do not know her yet. He looked at her again, and again there was that movement in his face, that thing that approached a different expression and then did not quite arrive at it. He said, she sleeps in the barn, at least to start. She said, that seems fair. When the ranch came into view, Willa looked at it carefully and without performing any particular reaction. It was modest. The house was a single-story adobe structure with a covered porch along the front and 2 windows flanking the door, each with plain cotton curtains that someone had made an effort to wash recently. There was a barn behind the house, solid-looking, and a corral where 4 horses stood in the last of the afternoon shade, and a windmill turning slowly in a steady desert breeze. Cottonwood trees, 3 of them, had been planted along the eastern side of the house and had grown tall enough to cast real shade. She thought, he planted those trees. That was a choice someone makes when they intend to stay. She said, you planted the cottonwoods. He pulled the horses to a stop and set the brake. He looked at the trees for a moment. He said, first year I was here. They take time to establish, but once they do, they are worth it. She said, yes. He climbed down and came around to hand her down from the wagon. His hand was rough, calloused across the palm and fingers, warm despite the dry air. She took it without hesitation and stepped down, and he released her hand the moment she was steady, which told her something about the kind of man he was in the same way the ironed shirt had. She looked at the house. She looked at the cottonwoods. She looked at the desert rolling away in every direction, enormous and honest and unforgiving in a way that felt, unexpectedly, like something close to relief. Because there was no pretending out here. The land did not allow for it. What you were plainly, and what the land was, it was plainly. And Willa Ashford had been living for a long time in a city full of people pretending to be things they were not. And she found, standing in the September dust of Gila Bend, Arizona territory, that she was more tired of pretending than she had understood. She said quietly, more to herself than to him, "It is beautiful." Everett Calhoun, who had been lifting her trunk from the wagon bed, paused. He looked at the landscape. Then he looked at her, with something in his expression that she could not quite name. Something that was not surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it, as though she had said something he had not expected to hear from her. He said, "Yes, it is." Behind them, the dog made a small sound and pressed her nose against the back of Willa's knee through the side of the wagon, and Willa reached back without looking and rested her hand on the dog's head for a moment, and the dog went quiet. Inside the house, Everett showed her the 2 rooms, the kitchen with its cast-iron stove and its shelves of orderly supplies, the main room with its stone fireplace and its single rocking chair, and its floor covered in woven rugs. On the kitchen table, there were 3 wildflowers in a jar, already beginning to droop in the heat, the kind of flowers that grow at the edge of dry washes after the rains. Willa looked at them and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it a larger moment than he wanted it to be. But she noticed them. She would remember them. Her room was small and clean. The mattress was new, still with a slight smell of fresh ticking. There was a narrow window that looked out toward the east, and in the morning, she would discover, it caught the first light of the sun before anything else in the house did. She set her carpet bags down. She straightened and looked at the room for a moment, and then she walked back to the kitchen where Everett was standing with his hands in his pockets in the way of a man who is not sure what he is supposed to do next. She said, "Shall I start supper?" He looked briefly startled, and then the startlement resolved into something more settled. He said, "I have a chicken dressed and ready. There are potatoes in the bin and onions hanging near the stove." She said, "Then I will need about 45 minutes. He said, "I will go see to the horses." He went out. The door did not quite close behind him, and through the gap Willa could see the pale rectangle of the open desert, and at the edge of the porch, the dog sitting in the last of the sunlight with her ears up and her eyes following Everett toward the barn. Willa stood in the kitchen of Everett Calhoun's ranch house in the Arizona Territory in September of 1883 and took a breath. Then she found the skillet, located the salt, and started the fire. The first week passed in the way that unfamiliar things sometimes do, not quickly and not slowly, but with a particular texture of attention, everything slightly too sharp at the edges because nothing was yet automatic. Willa woke before dawn each morning, as she had for the past 2 years, a habit formed in the Philadelphia house where the early hours were the only ones that belonged to her. She dressed in the dark, built the kitchen fire, and had coffee ready by the time Everett came in from his first round of the morning chores. He never asked how she had managed the stove or where she had found the matches. He simply came in, poured a cup, and drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the brightening sky, and then went back out again. It was not unfriendly. It was the behavior of a man who had lived alone long enough that his mornings had calcified into a specific shape, and who did not yet know how to reshape them around another person's presence. Willa understood this. She had her own shapes that needed reshaping. She cooked and cleaned and took stock of the kitchen supplies with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has managed a household on limited resources and knows exactly what careful inventory can prevent. The pantry was adequate but unimaginative, the stores of a man who ate for fuel rather than pleasure. She made a mental list of what she would ask for on the next trip to town. She also, on the morning of the 3rd day, found the account books. They were in a wooden box on the shelf above the desk in the corner of the main room. 3 ledgers, 1 older and 2 recent, along with a folded stack of receipts held together with a piece of twine. She did not open them immediately. She set her hand on the cover of the top ledger and stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of Everett working in the barn, the steady rhythm of something being repaired, and made a decision. She sat down at the desk and opened the first ledger. She had kept her husband's books in Philadelphia, and before that, she had helped her father with the accounts of his small dry goods operation from the time she was 12 years old. Numbers were not difficult for her. More than that, numbers told a story, and she had learned early that the story numbers told was frequently more honest than the story the person who owned them was telling himself. She worked through the first ledger in about an hour, making small notes on a piece of paper she found in the drawer. Then she started on the second. The morning lengthened around her. The light moved across the floor. Somewhere outside, Flint, which was what she had begun calling the dog in her own mind without yet committing to it aloud, could be heard investigating the perimeter of the yard with the systematic intensity of an animal for whom every smell was a new and urgent communication. When Everett came in at mid-morning for water, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her at the desk with the ledger open in front of her. She did not look up. She said, "I hope you do not mind. I wanted to understand the operation." There was a pause. He said, "Those are my private accounts." She said, "Yes?" She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. "I am not prying for the sake of it. If I am going to be useful to this ranch, I need to understand its finances. But if you would prefer I wait until you show me yourself, I will close them now." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without apology and without aggression, simply waiting, which she had found was the most effective approach with a man who needed to believe that his decisions were his own. He said, "What have you found?" She said, "I am not finished yet." He said, "When you are finished, tell me what you found." He poured his water and went back out. Willa looked at the door for a moment, and then she turned back to the ledger. She finished by noon. She sat with her notes in front of her and looked at them for a while before Everett came in for the midday meal. She had made bread that morning, the first bread she had baked since leaving Philadelphia, and the kitchen smelled of it in a way that seemed to change the quality of the air in the whole house, as though warmth could be a scent. They ate without talking much, which was becoming its own kind of language between them. He ate with the focused attention of someone who had been working hard since before sunrise and was hungry in a clean and uncomplicated way. She refilled his coffee without being asked and then sat back down across from him. After a while he said, "The books." She said, "Yes." He waited. She said, "Your operating expenses are reasonable. Your cattle numbers are consistent with what you described in your letters. The income from last fall's sale was fair for the market. None of that is the problem." He said, "What is the problem?" She said, "The loan terms." She unfolded her notes and laid them on the table between them. "The interest rate you are paying to the Territorial Bank is higher than any standard commercial rate I have seen. It started at a reasonable rate in the first year, and then it stepped up. Each adjustment is documented, but the documentation refers to a secondary agreement I cannot find in your files. Do you have a secondary agreement?" Everett looked at the notes. His expression had gone very still. He said, "I signed something 3 years ago, when I needed the money for the second herd. The man from the bank said it was standard procedure." "What was his name?" Everett said, "The agent was a man named Pruitt, Silas Pruitt. He handles several of the land accounts in this area. He is not a bank employee exactly. He is more of an independent agent who works with the bank on rural accounts." Willa wrote the name down carefully. She said, "And since then, have you dealt directly with the bank or through Pruitt?" "Mostly through Pruitt. He comes out twice a year for the payment collection." She looked at the notes again. She said, "I would like to write to the Territorial Bank directly, to confirm the terms of the original loan, not through Pruitt." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think something is wrong?" She said, "I think something may be worth confirming." She folded her notes and looked at him steadily. "I am not making an accusation. I am saying that the numbers do not add up in the way they should, and that in my experience that usually means something has been added or removed that is not visible yet. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the bread-warm air of the mid-morning, and she could see him working through something, not arguing with her, not dismissing her, but genuinely thinking, which was its own kind of answer about the sort of man he was. He said, "Write the letter." She said, "I will need paper and a proper envelope." He stood and went to the desk and came back with both. She wrote the letter that afternoon, careful and precise, requesting confirmation of the original loan terms and any amendments, signed with her name as a party to the ranch operation, which was now legally true. She did not tell him what she suspected yet. The numbers had told her a story, but it was not complete, and she had learned that an incomplete story told with too much certainty caused more damage than waiting for the rest of it. On the fourth day, Silas Pruitt came to the ranch. Willa was hanging laundry on the line strung between the two eastern cottonwoods when she heard the horse coming up the road. She turned to look. The man who rode up was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory, with a silver watch chain visible across his vest and a hat that was better quality than it needed to be for ranch country. His face was arranged in an expression of pleasant sociability that had nothing behind it. He dismounted and called out to Everett, who had come to the barn door, in the tone of a man who considers himself welcome wherever he arrives. He said, "Calhoun, I heard you had a new addition to the household. Just riding by, thought I would pay my respects." Everett came out into the yard. He said, "Pruitt, this is Willa, my wife." The word was the first time Willa had heard Everett use it, and it landed differently than she had anticipated, not uncomfortably, but with a kind of weight that she registered and set aside for later consideration. Silas Pruitt turned to look at her with the pleasant expression still in place. He said, "Well, congratulations are in order." He looked her over in the way that some men look at a woman, not lewdly, but assessingly, the way a man evaluates something he is considering buying, which Willa recognized and did not show that she recognized. He said, "Philadelphia, is it? I heard you came from back east." She said, "Yes." He said, "Long way to come." He looked around the ranch with a proprietary ease, at the house, the barn, the corral, as though he was taking an inventory of things he expected to have access to eventually. He said, "Calhoun, I want you to know I am still interested in that northern parcel whenever you are ready to talk. Good water access. I would pay fairly." Everett said, "It is not for sale." Pruitt smiled the smile of a man who has heard that before and considers it a temporary position. He said, "Of course, whenever you are ready." He looked back at Willa and said, "I hope you will find this country suits you, Mrs. Calhoun. It takes some getting used to. Some women never manage it." Willa looked at him with an expression of polite neutrality that she had spent 2 years perfecting in rooms full of people who wished she would go away. She said, "I find I am managing it well enough." Pruitt held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly conversational. Then he remounted with the ease of a practiced horseman and said, "Pleasant afternoon to you both," and rode back down the road at a leisurely pace, as though he had all the time in the world, which was a specific kind of message from a specific kind of man. When he was out of sight, Everett came to stand beside Willa at the laundry line. He did not say anything immediately. She reached into the basket for another shirt and clipped it to the line, and they stood there together in the cottonwood shade. She said, "How long has he been interested in the northern parcel?" Everett said, 3 years. She said, "And how long has your interest rate been higher than standard?" A pause. He said, 3 years. She let that sit between them like the figure in a ledger column, neither of them looking at it directly yet, but both aware of its presence. She said, "We should wait for the letter back from the bank before we draw conclusions." He said, "Yes." But neither of them believed any longer that the conclusions were going to be ones they wanted to draw. That evening after supper, Flint, who had been sleeping in the barn as negotiated, and who had expressed her opinion of this arrangement each morning by sitting outside the kitchen door with a look of pointed reproach until Willa opened it, sat on the porch between the two of them while the sun went down. Everett had 2 cups of coffee. Willa had 1. The desert light went through its evening changes, the long flat gold of late afternoon deepening into copper, and then the improbable oranges and pinks of actual sunset, colors that seemed slightly too vivid to be real, as though the sky were making an effort. Willa said, "I would like to learn to ride properly. I can manage a horse, but I have only ever ridden with someone else on a road. Out here, it seems necessary to know more than that." Everett said, "I can teach you." She said, "I would not want to take time from your work." He said, "It is practical. If something happened and you needed to ride to town or to a neighbor's, you would need to know the land as well as the horse." She said, "Then I am grateful." A silence that was not uncomfortable. Flint put her chin on Everett's boot without asking permission and watched the darkening desert with great attention, as though she were performing a useful service. Everett looked down at the dog. He said, "She has decided she lives here." Willa said, "She decided that on the stage line." He said, "Does she have a name?" Willa said, "I have been thinking about it." She looked at the dog. She appeared and would not be discouraged, and has a kind of hardness under the soft exterior that I think is her most honest quality. I thought Flint. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That suits her." He said it the way he said most things, without particular decoration, but she heard in it what was behind it, which was that he had thought about a name himself, or at least had been waiting for one, and that hers was right. The riding lessons began 3 days later, early in the morning while the heat was still manageable. Everett was a patient teacher in the specific way of someone who has never formally taught anything, but understands the physical logic of what he knows well enough to explain it plainly. He did not assume she was helpless. He did not assume she was capable. He watched what she did and corrected what needed correcting and said nothing about what did not. By the second lesson, she could feel the difference in how she sat the horse, something settling into the correct position, and by the 4th, she was able to read the horse's movement in a way she had not been able to before. The small shifts of weight and ear and muscle that told you what the animal was thinking before it thought it all the way through. Everett said on the morning of the 4th lesson, "You have a feel for it. Some people never get it, no matter how long they ride. You have it." Willa said, "My husband's cousin had horses. I was allowed to exercise them occasionally when they needed it." She paused. It was the most useful thing about those 14 months. He looked at her with that careful attention he gave to things she said about her life before. He never pushed. He asked nothing directly about her marriage or her time in Philadelphia, but he listened when she offered pieces of it with a quality of attention that told her the information was being kept and considered rather than simply heard and forgotten. She appreciated that more than she had words for. The days had begun to develop a shape that felt less provisional than the first week had. Willa learned the small geography of the ranch's routines with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, understanding that household knowledge was not merely domestic, but tactical, that knowing where things were and how they worked was a form of power as real as any other. She learned that the chickens needed their water changed by mid-morning, or they grew difficult. She learned that the third horse from the left in the corral, a gray gelding named Porter, whom Everett had never bothered to explain, could be persuaded into cooperation only if you approached from the right side and gave him a full minute before touching him. She learned that the windmill made a particular sound before a weather change, a slightly higher pitch in the mechanism, and that this sound was reliable enough to be worth listening for. Everett noticed that she noticed these things. She could tell by the small adjustments he made and how he spoke to her about the ranch, moving from the basic explanations of the first days to the kind of shorthand that exists between people who share a working knowledge of the same territory. He stopped explaining what the windmill meant when it made the high sound. He simply said, "Weather coming," and she knew what that meant and what to do about it. There were evenings that surprised her. They would finish supper, and she would expect the silence that had characterized the first week, the careful, courteous distance of two people who do not yet know each other's habits. Instead, Everett would sometimes remain at the table after the meal, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and something in his posture would suggest that he had a thing on his mind that he had not yet decided whether to say. She learned to wait for these moments without filling them prematurely. She had learned, in Philadelphia, the difference between silence that invites and silence that closes, and Everett's evening silences were of the first kind. One such evening, 9 days after her arrival, he said, "I have been thinking about the Northern Creek." She said, "The parcel Pruitt wants." He said, "Yes." He looked at the table. "It is the best water access on the property. In a dry year, which this country has regularly, that parcel is the difference between losing cattle and keeping them." He paused. I knew Pruitt wanted it. I told myself it was because he was a man who wanted everything adjacent to him. I did not think more carefully than that. She said, "You had no reason to." He said I should have. She let that sit. Then she said, "Men who do what Pruitt does rely on the fact that most people do not think more carefully than that. If everyone examined every transaction with the thoroughness you are describing, they could not operate. The scheme requires ordinary trust to function. He found it in you because you are a person who extends ordinary trust. That is not a flaw." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You do not extend it as readily." She said, "I did once." She looked at her hands. Watching George's situation develop the way it did, the notes and the agreements and the people who seemed helpful until the moment they were not, taught me to read the secondary document before I trusted the primary one. She paused. "I do not think of it as suspicious. I think of it as thorough." He said, "Where did you learn to keep accounts?" She said, "My father had a dry goods store in Harrisburg. He was a good man and a decent businessman, but he did not love the numbers the way I did. He said the numbers were a necessary evil. I thought they were the most honest part of the whole operation. Everything else you could obscure. The numbers told you exactly where you stood." Everett said, "And where do I stand?" She said, "Better than you think, once the loan terms are corrected. Your operation is sound. The cattle numbers are good for the acreage. The issue is not the ranch itself. The issue is what Pruitt has layered over it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you looked at the books." She said, "I know." She met his eyes. "I am glad you let me." The evenings on the porch had become another kind of routine. After supper and dishes, when the heat had broken and the desert air had cooled to something almost comfortable, they would sit with their coffee and watch the light go out of the sky in its extravagant nightly performance. Flint would position herself between them, monitoring the horizon for threats with the vigilance of a small dog who has taken on responsibilities somewhat larger than her physical stature. Willa had discovered that these hours were when Everett was most accessible, when the work of the day had been set down and the requirements of the next day had not yet been picked up, and the man who lived behind the economy of his daily expression was briefly visible. She did not press or probe. She simply remained, which seemed to be enough. One evening he pointed to a ridge of dark rock to the northwest and said, "There is a spring up there. Not much, but reliable. I found it the first winter I was here, when I thought I had made a serious mistake coming to this country." He paused. I went up there to think. The spring was still going, and there were these small desert flowers growing right at the edge of it, orange and yellow, impossibly alive in all that rock. I sat there for 2 hours. When I came back down, I had decided to stay. She said, "What were you thinking about up there?" He said, whether the land was worth it, whether I was capable of what it required. He looked at the ridge. I concluded that the land was worth anything and that I would become capable of whatever it required or die attempting it. He said this last part without drama, as a simple statement of what had been true, which I recognize sounds excessive. She said, "It does not sound excessive at all. It sounds like the exact decision that had to be made." He looked at her. She said, "I made a version of it myself, getting on the stage in Philadelphia." She looked at the darkening desert. Not the same stakes, but the same structure, deciding that the thing in front of me was worth whatever it cost and that I would be equal to the cost or I would not. But that remaining where I was not an option I was willing to continue choosing. The coyotes had started up somewhere to the east, their particular evening conversation, and Flint lifted her head and listened with deep professional interest before apparently concluding that they were at a sufficient distance not to require intervention. Everett said, "Do you miss Philadelphia?" She considered the question seriously. She said, "I miss certain specific things. The library on Chestnut Street, a particular bakery near where I grew up, the sound of the city in the early morning before the traffic began, when it was quiet enough to hear birds." She paused. "I do not miss the life I was living there. I had already left it before I got on the stage. I was simply still present in the location." He said, "I understand that." She believed that he did. On the 8th day, Willa found something else in the accounts. She had gone back to the ledgers after Everett rode out to check the far fence line, and she had been working through the older book, the one that predated her arrival by several years, tracing the loan payments forward from the beginning. The original rate was there, documented clearly, reasonable, as Everett had said. And then the adjustment, 3 years in, referencing the secondary agreement. But she had also found, tucked into the back pages of the older ledger behind a map of the ranch boundaries, a copy of the original deed of survey. She spread it out on the desk and looked at it carefully. The boundary lines were drawn in clear ink, the corners marked with legal descriptions referencing specific rock formations and a seasonal creek that ran along the northern edge. The northern parcel that Silas Pruitt wanted, the one with the good water access, was there on the map, plainly within the survey lines of Everett's property. She sat back and thought about that for a while. Then she got up and found the oldest of the receipt bundles, the ones from the earliest years, and went through them one by one until she found what she was looking for. A receipt for a survey and land registration, dated in the year before Everett had taken his loan, made out in Everett's name, signed and stamped by the Territorial Land Office. A different receipt, dated 2 months after the loan and the secondary agreement for a survey amendment, made out in the name of a land company she did not recognize, registered through an agent she recognized immediately, Silas Pruitt. She sat with both receipts on the desk in front of her and was very still for a moment, the way you are still when something has just resolved into a clarity you were partly hoping would not come. Then she got up and found a clean sheet of paper and began making notes. She was still at the desk when she heard the horse in the yard, and a moment later, Everett came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. He said, "What is it?" She said, "Sit down." He sat. She laid out the receipts side by side, and the survey map next to them. She walked him through it the way she had worked through it herself, piece by piece, without rushing, without letting her own anger into her voice, because her anger was not useful here, and because the anger was also partly at herself for having hoped the letter from the bank would come back clean. Everett listened without interrupting. He looked at the receipts. He looked at the map. He looked at them for a long time. She said, "He amended the survey after you signed the secondary agreement. The northern parcel, the portion with the creek access, was re-registered under a holding company that Pruitt controls. On paper, it is no longer yours. On paper, it may have never been yours, if the amendment was backdated, which I cannot confirm yet from what we have here." Everett said nothing. She said, "The higher interest rate may be tied to the amendment. If the collateral on the loan was partially removed from your assets, the bank may have been told that the loan was undersecured, which would justify the rate increase in their records, without any of it looking improper from the outside." Everett said, "I signed a piece of paper 3 years ago that I did not fully read." She said, "You trusted a man who presented himself as acting in your interest." He said, "That was foolish." She said, "It was ordinary." She kept her voice level. People trust the person in front of them until they have a reason not to. He gave you no reason until after the damage was done. That is how this kind of thing works. He stood up and went to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness in someone who is holding something in rather than letting it out. She waited. She did not go to him, and she did not speak, because some moments need to be survived privately before they can be shared. After a long time, he said, "How long has this been going on?" She said, "The amendment was registered 3 years ago. But I think he has been watching this land longer than that. The water access on the northern parcel is worth considerably more than the parcel itself. If he can force a default on the loan, he may be able to acquire the whole ranch through the bank, not just the northern portion." Another silence. He turned around. His face was the same careful face it always was. But there was something underneath it now, not anger exactly, something older and harder than anger, the look of a man who has built something with his own hands over years and has just understood clearly that someone has been working against him the whole time. He said, "You are not finished yet." The letter to the bank. She said, "No. And I want to write to the Territorial Land Office as well. Request a copy of the registered amendments with the original filing dates. If the amendment was backdated, there will be a discrepancy somewhere. These things are not perfectly clean. even when they are carefully done. He said, "You know how to do that." She said, "I know how to read documents and ask the right questions of the right offices. I did it for 2 years in Philadelphia trying to sort out my husband's debts." She paused. "I did not save those. But I learned everything there was to know about doing it." He looked at her across the room. She was sitting at his desk, surrounded by his papers, in his house, in a territory she had never seen 3 weeks ago, and she was looking back at him with the steady green eyes that had not looked away from anything since she arrived. He said, "I am glad you came." It was not a romantic declaration. It was stated with the same plainness he brought to everything, the direct economy of a man who did not say things unless he meant them, which meant that when he did say them, they carried a particular weight. She said, "I am finding I am as well." Outside, Flint barked once at something in the yard, and then fell silent. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the floor in a long, warm rectangle, and the letter Willa had begun was still on the desk waiting to be finished. And the problem was large and not yet solved. But it was named now, which was the first and most necessary step. She picked up her pen. She said, "I will need the name of the Territorial Land Office agent you originally registered with." He crossed the room and stood at her shoulder and read the papers spread across his desk and told her what she needed to know. The letter from the Territorial Bank arrived on a Tuesday, 12 days after Willa had sent hers. Everett brought it in from town, along with the weekly supplies, setting it on the kitchen table without comment, though she could see from the way he set it down, carefully, away from the edge, that he had been thinking about it the whole ride back. She finished what she was doing at the stove before she picked it up. She had learned in Philadelphia that there was no point in hurrying toward bad news. She opened it and read it twice before she spoke. She said, "The bank confirms the original loan terms. The rate they have on file for your account is the adjusted rate. The secondary agreement is recorded as a standard amendment. They consider it properly executed." Everett was leaning against the doorframe. He said, "So from the bank's position, everything is correct." She said, "From the bank's position, yes." She set the letter on the table, which means if Pruitt altered anything, he altered it before it reached the bank. The bank is not party to the fraud. They may simply be its instrument. He said, "And the land office letter. Still waiting." She had sent that one to Tucson, which meant a longer transit. She had been precise in what she asked for. The original filing record, the amendment filing record, the dates of both, and the name of the agent who processed the amendment. If there was a discrepancy in the dates, it would be there. She looked at the bank letter again. She said, "I want to be honest with you about what we are working with. What I suspect is substantial. What I can prove at this moment is limited. If we confront Pruitt before we have the land office records, he will have time to manage whatever there is to manage. I would rather wait." Everett said, "How much longer?" She said, 2 weeks at most for the land office response. Possibly less." He was quiet. She could see him doing the calculation he had been doing since she had laid out the receipts on his desk. The calculation of a man who has understood that the ground beneath him is less solid than he believed, and who is trying to determine how much weight it will still bear. He said, "All right, we wait." She nodded and folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box with the other documents she had begun collecting. She had started a separate section in the box, a small envelope of her own, containing copies she had made of the relevant receipts, the survey map, her notes. She did not tell Everett she had made copies. It was not distrust. It was simply the habit of a woman who had learned that the only documents that were truly safe were the ones whose existence was known only to herself. The days that followed had the quality of a held breath. The ranch work continued as it always did, because cattle and horses and chickens do not observe the human need for pause. Willa learned the rhythms of the operation in the way she learned everything, through sustained attention and a willingness to be corrected without embarrassment. She learned which of the 4 horses would accept a stranger's handling and which required a specific approach, a hand on the neck first before anything else, an acknowledgement before a request. She learned the feel of the desert morning, the particular cold of the hour before dawn that burned off so completely by midday, you could not believe it had ever existed. She learned that the cottonwood trees sounded different in the afternoon wind than the morning wind, a higher note, less patient. Everett taught her these things without teaching them, the way knowledge is most durably transferred through proximity and example rather than instruction. She watched how he moved through the day and understood from the watching. And Flint grew. It happened with the accelerated urgency of puppyhood, visibly, almost daily. Her legs lengthened. Her ears, which had seemed comically large for her head, began to fit her better as the rest of her caught up. She was not a large dog and would not become one, but she had a density to her, a compactness of muscle that was becoming apparent as the starvation weight gave way to the weight of a properly fed animal. She was quick. She was watchful. And she had established without negotiation that her territory encompassed the house, the barn, the yard, and every person and animal within those boundaries, each of whom she felt responsible for in ways that were occasionally inconvenient and consistently endearing. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun following Everett. Not exclusively. She still pressed herself against Willa's ankle at every available opportunity and slept outside the kitchen door each morning until it opened. But something in her had recognized Everett as a fixed point worth monitoring, and she had appointed herself his shadow on the morning rounds with the gravity of someone accepting a serious responsibility. Everett pretended not to notice this, but Willa noticed that he had started leaving the barn door open a few inches wider than necessary, and that there was a second water bowl near the corral that had not been there in the first week. It was on a Thursday morning, the 17th day after Willa's arrival, that Everett rode out to check the eastern fence line, and Flint went with him. Willa was in the kitchen when she heard it. Not the sound of the snake. She would not have heard that from the house. What she heard was Flint, a sound she had not heard the dog make before, sharp and continuous and carrying in it a quality of alarm that was entirely distinct from the territorial barking Flint used on the ravens that landed in the yard. She was out the kitchen door before she had completed the thought. She ran toward the sound, which was coming from the far side of the eastern pasture, near the pile of flat rocks that caught the morning sun and held its heat. She covered the distance fast, her skirt gathered in one fist, her eyes finding Everett before she had fully stopped moving. He was crouched in the dirt holding Flint against his chest, his face set. The dog was not making the alarm sound anymore. She was making a smaller sound, the sound of pain, and her left front leg was hanging wrong. Willa reached them and dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him. She said, "Where?" He said, "Front leg. Rattler." It was already on the rocks when she got to them. She went in before I could stop her. Willa looked at the leg. The puncture marks were visible just above the joint, two small wounds already beginning to raise the skin around them. The swelling had started. She pressed two fingers against Flint's side and felt the dog's heartbeat, fast but present. She said, "How long ago?" He said, 4 minutes, maybe 5. I rode straight back. She said, "Carry her to the house. Keep the leg below her heart. Do not let her struggle." He was already standing with the dog held against him, Flint's injured leg dangling carefully away from pressure. Willa walked beside them, her hand on Flint's head, and the dog's dark eyes found her face, and stayed there with an expression of concentrated trust that Willa filed away in the part of herself that was not currently occupied with the medical problem. In the house, she directed Everett to lay Flint on the table, which he did without questioning whether a dog belonged on a kitchen table. Willa found her sewing kit, the smallest of her needles and her sharpest scissors, and she found the matches and the whiskey that lived in the back of the low cabinet, and she worked quickly and without speaking because speech would have slowed her hands. She cleaned the wound. She made the small incisions with the needle heated in a match flame and applied what suction she could. She had done this once before, not for a snake bite, but for a deep cut that had needed the same kind of careful management, and the principle was similar enough that her hands knew what to do, even while her mind was still arriving at the same knowledge. Flint bore it with a stillness that Willa recognized as the particular stillness of a creature that has already survived harder things and knows that enduring is the available option. She whimpered twice, both times when the pressure changed, and both times Everett's hand tightened slightly where he was holding her steady. When Willa had done what could be done, she wrapped the leg loosely to slow the movement of the venom, and they moved Flint to a blanket near the stove, where the warmth would help with the shock, and the light was good enough to monitor her through the afternoon. They stayed, not by agreement or discussion. Everett did not go back out to the fence line, and Willa did not suggest he should. They simply both remained, taking turns sitting near the blanket, watching the small rise and fall of Flint's breathing and the slow progress of the swelling, which spread up the leg for the first 2 hours, and then, as the afternoon deepened, seemed to stop. By evening, the swelling had stabilized. Flint was breathing more evenly. She had accepted water twice, lapping it from Willa's cupped hand with an exhausted deliberateness. The worst appeared to be over, though the worst being over did not mean the next several days would be easy. Everett built the fire up because the desert nights had begun to carry the first edge of autumn cold, and then he brought in 2 chairs from the main room and set them near the stove, and they sat. He said, "The last time I sat up through the night with an animal was 4 years ago. A horse with colic." She said, "Did it survive?" He said, "No." He looked at Flint. "She is stronger than that horse was. And the situation is different. You knew what to do." She said, "I had a neighbor in Philadelphia who kept dogs and had encountered snakebite before. I helped her once. I remembered what she did." He said, "You remember things carefully." She said, "I always have." Her mother had called it a burden when she was a child, the way nothing left her memory entirely, every detail still present and retrievable. She had come to consider it a tool. They were quiet for a while. The fire moved. Flint's breathing deepened toward something closer to real sleep. Outside, the wind had come up, as it did most September nights in the territory, moving through the cottonwoods with a sound like something being patiently explained. Everett said, "I grew up in a house with 4 brothers, never quiet, never still." He paused. "I thought when I came out here that this silence would be temporary. that once I had built something worth having, people would come. He looked at the fire. They did not come. She said, "Families are strange that way. The ones that should hold you often do not, and the ones that do are often the ones you did not expect." He said, "Your husband's family?" She said, "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap. George was the kind of person who believed the best about everyone, including people who did not deserve it. His family was polite to me when he was alive and made it clear after he died that their politeness had been on loan. She paused. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because I think it is important to know the difference between people who are in your life and people who are simply near you. He said, "That is an important difference." She said, "It took me longer than it should have to learn it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father told me the morning I left that I would come back in a year with my tail between my legs. He said the territory was no place for a man without connections or capital, and that ambition without those things was just vanity." She said, "And you did not go back?" He said, "I will not go back until I have something worth showing him." He paused. "That sounds like pride." She said, "It sounds like the reasonable response to an unfair judgment from someone who should have believed in you." He looked at her then, a direct look, unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, as though something he had kept carefully behind the careful face had moved briefly into the light. He said, "You are very direct." She said, "I spent 14 months being indirect about everything, and it did not help anything. I decided when I got on the stage in Yuma that I was finished with indirection." Something shifted in his expression, not the near smile she had seen occasionally, something more interior than that, a quality of recognition, as though she had said something that named a thing he had felt without having the words for it. He said, "I wrote 4 letters to the agency before yours." The other women wrote back. 2 of them were perfectly suitable. I did not write to them again. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because their letters read like applications, like they were presenting credentials." He looked at the fire. "Yours read like you were talking to someone." She said, "I had decided to be honest or not to write at all." He said, "I know. I could tell." Flint made a small sound from her blanket, not distress. A shifting, a resettlement. Willa leaned forward and checked the leg, the swelling still holding where it had stopped, the skin warm but not dangerously so. The dog opened one eye and looked at her and then closed it again. Willa sat back. The fire had burned down to a steady pulse of orange light. The wind had eased outside. The house was warm and the night pressed against the windows with the specific weight of a desert night. The enormous sky above it, full of stars that were visible here in a way they were never visible in any city Willa had ever lived in, as though the darkness was a necessary condition for that particular kind of light. She said, "I was afraid, on the stage, not of the territory or the work." She paused, finding the precise words. "I was afraid that I had become the kind of person who only knew how to survive things, that the surviving had used up whatever was underneath it." He did not respond immediately. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He said, "I know what that is." She looked at him. He said, "After the second year out here, I realized I had stopped making plans further than a season ahead, not because of practicality, because I had stopped believing the further ahead was a place I was going to inhabit." He stopped. "That is not easy to say." She said, "I know," he said, and then something changed. I do not know exactly when. I planted the third cottonwood tree, and I realized I was planting it for the shade it would give in 10 years, not for now. And I thought, that is a future self making a decision. That self still exists. She looked at the side of his face in the firelight. The jaw, the careful eyes, the particular quality of a man who has lived a long time inside his own silences and has learned to be precise with words because of it. She said, "The cottonwoods were the first thing I noticed when we arrived." He said, "I know. You said so." She said, "I said it was beautiful." He said, "Yes." He paused. "You were the first person who has ever said that about this place and meant it without performing it." The fire settled. Flint breathed. The night held them in the particular intimacy of shared vigil, which is one of the oldest forms of closeness. Two people awake together in the dark, watching over something they have both decided matters. Willa did not sleep until after midnight. When she did, she fell asleep in the chair, her head tilting sideways. And she did not know until the morning that at some point Everett had placed his folded jacket over her shoulders against the cold. She found it there when she woke in the gray hour before the sun came up, Everett asleep in his own chair across from her, and Flint awake and watching both of them from her blanket with the satisfied expression of a small dog who has arranged things to her satisfaction. Willa sat still for a moment in the early quiet, the jacket around her shoulders, the fire burned to coals, the man across from her asleep, with his chin dropped toward his chest and all the careful arrangements of his face released into something younger and less guarded. She thought about what he had said about the cottonwood trees, about the future self making a decision. She thought about the letter still waiting to arrive from the land office in Tucson, and about Silas Pruitt riding up the road with his silver watch chain and his proprietary eyes, and about the account books spread across the desk, and about all the things that were still unresolved and pressing and real. And then she thought, separately, and without entirely meaning to, that she had slept better in that chair than she had slept in 14 months, in a narrow room with a window that faced a brick wall. She got up quietly and went to the stove and rebuilt the fire. By the time the coffee was ready, Everett was awake, and Flint was sitting up on her blanket with her injured leg held carefully and her tail making small, hopeful movements. And the sun was coming through the eastern window in the long gold lines of a September morning in the Arizona Territory. Willa poured 2 cups. She set one on the arm of Everett's chair without being asked. He picked it up and drank without speaking, and looked at Flint, and then looked at Willa, and said, "She is going to be all right." Willa said, "Yes, she is." And they both understood, without saying so, that they were not talking only about the dog. They were married on a Thursday morning in late September, in the front room of Harriet Yoel's boarding house, because the circuit preacher was passing through Gila Bend, and Harriet had arranged it with the efficiency she applied to everything she considered necessary. There were no flowers. There was no ceremony beyond the words themselves, which the preacher read from a worn book in a voice accustomed to saying them in all kinds of weather and circumstance. Harriet stood as witness with her arms folded, and her expression suggesting she would accept nothing less than full commitment from both parties. Flint sat at Willa's feet throughout. When the preacher asked Everett if he took this woman, Everett looked at Willa with the brown eyes that had been measuring and careful since the first moment, and said yes in the same plain voice he used for everything that mattered. When the preacher asked Willa, she looked back at him and said yes, without looking away. Harriet said, "Good," and went to put the coffee on. Willa's hand was steady. She noticed that Everett's was too. Afterward, riding back to the ranch in the late September light, with Flint sitting between them in the wagon and the desert going gold at the edges of the afternoon, neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have said the thing that matters and are now simply living inside it. He said eventually, "I want you to know that what I said in there was not only ceremony." She said, "I know." She looked at the road ahead. Neither was mine. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Willa had sent hers, carried in by Everett along with the mail and a sack of flour from the general store in Gila Bend. He set it on the table the same way he had set the bank letter, carefully, away from the edge. She looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Outside, Flint was moving around the yard on 3 legs with a determination that had made Willa laugh 3 days running. The injured leg healing well, but still held up with the instinctive caution of an animal that has learned something about the cost of carelessness. Willa opened the letter and read it standing at the table. She read it twice. Then she sat down. The land office had been thorough, more thorough than she had expected, perhaps because her letter had been precise in what it asked for, and land office clerks, in her experience, responded better to precision than to vague inquiry. The response confirmed the original filing date of Everett's land claim. It confirmed the boundary survey, and it confirmed, in the careful language of official correspondence, that an amendment to the northern boundary had been filed 14 months after the original claim, processed through a registered land agent, amending the survey to exclude a parcel of approximately 40 acres along the northern creek line, re-registered under the name of a land-holding company. The agent of record for the amendment was listed as S. Pruitt, licensed agent, Gila Bend, Arizona Territory. The filing date of the amendment was 10 months before the date on the amendment receipt she had found in Everett's papers. She sat with that discrepancy for a long moment. 10 months. The receipt in Everett's files was dated 10 months after the actual filing, which meant the receipt had been created after the fact, inserted into Everett's papers to suggest that Everett himself had requested and authorized an amendment that had in fact been filed without his knowledge, and backdated to make it appear routine. If anyone had ever looked, which no one apparently had, it would have appeared that Everett had agreed to reduce his own land claim. It was not a complicated scheme. It was the kind of scheme that works precisely because it does not need to be complicated, only invisible. And it had been invisible for 3 years because no one had looked at the numbers carefully enough to know where to look. Willa was still sitting at the table when Everett came in from the barn. He looked at her face and closed the door behind him. She laid the letter and the original receipt side by side on the table and walked him through it the same way she had walked him through the account books, piece by piece, without rushing. She showed him the filing date. She showed him the receipt date. She showed him the 10-month gap between them. She said, "He filed the amendment without your knowledge or authorization." The receipt in your files is not a record of something you agreed to. It is a document manufactured to make it appear that you did. Everett stood across the table from her and looked at the 2 pieces of paper. He did not speak for a long time. She said, "This is enough to bring to a lawyer. A territorial court would recognize the date discrepancy as evidence of fraudulent filing. The land could potentially be restored to your claim. The loan terms, if they were adjusted on the basis of the fraudulent amendment, could be challenged as well." He said, "The nearest lawyer is in Tucson." She said, "Yes, I know." He said, "That is 3 days' travel." She said, "Yes." He stood there, and she watched him working through it. Not the legal logic. She could see he understood that. But something else, something older and more personal. The particular reckoning of a man who has prided himself on building something solid and has just been shown precisely how it was undermined. He said, "I signed a secondary agreement with him 3 years ago. I sat across a table from that man, and I signed a paper he put in front of me, and I did not read it carefully enough." She said, "The agreement may have been legitimate on its face. The fraud was in what he filed independently, not necessarily in what you signed." He said, "That does not change the fact that I was not careful enough." She did not argue with him. There are things a person needs to say to themselves that are not arguments to be won, but reckonings to be survived. And she had learned the difference. She said, "What would you like to do?" He said, "I need to think." She said, "Of course." She gathered the papers and put them back in the wooden box, which now contained enough documentation to constitute a real case if it was presented to the right person. She closed the lid and left it on the desk and went back to the kitchen and started the evening meal, because there was nothing else she could usefully do in that moment, and because keeping her hands occupied kept her from moving too fast toward the next thing. Everett went back outside. She heard him in the barn for a long time, the sounds of work, something being repaired or moved, the specific rhythm of a man who thinks best when his hands are doing something. She had learned this about him in the past 3 weeks, the way you learn the reliable things about a person, not from being told, but from watching what they reach for when they are working something through. She made biscuits and a pot of beans and sliced the last of the smoked pork. She set the table. She filled the water pitcher. She did all of it with the careful attention she gave to ordinary tasks when the extraordinary ones were not yet ready to be acted upon. When Everett came in for supper, he had the look of a man who has arrived at a decision but has not yet said it aloud. They ate. She did not push. The biscuits were good, better than the first batch she had made in this kitchen. She was calibrating the stove's particular temperament, and she noticed that Everett ate 3 of them without appearing to notice he was doing it. He said, "Finally, I want to go to Tucson." She said, "All right." He said, "I cannot leave the ranch for 3 days without someone here." He paused. "I could ask one of the Henley brothers from the next property over to keep an eye on the stock." She said, "Or I could go." He looked at her. She said, "I know what the documents say. I wrote the letters. I organized the evidence. I can present the case to a lawyer as clearly as you can, and possibly more so because I have been working with the specific details for 3 weeks. He was quiet. She said, "I am not suggesting you cannot do it yourself. I am suggesting that I am the more efficient choice, and that you staying with the ranch means the stock is properly managed and we do not need to depend on a neighbor." He said, "I do not love the idea of you traveling to Tucson alone." She said, "I rode the stage from Philadelphia to Yuma alone. Tucson is considerably closer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his expression settled. Not resignation, but something more like recognition. He said, "You have made this decision already." She said, "I made it when I read the letter. I was waiting to see if you would arrive at the same conclusion." He said, "And if I had not," she said, "I would have made the argument I just made." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, the particular movement at the corner of his mouth that she had catalogued over the past weeks as the nearest he generally came to it. He said, "Take the wooden box, all of it, and write down everything you have found in order so you can present it clearly from the beginning. She said, I have already done that. He looked at her. She said, I did it 2 days ago, in case the letter from the land office confirmed what I expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Willa? She said, yes. He said, I do not know how to thank you for this. She said, then do not try yet. Wait until there is something to thank me for. She left for Tucson on the Friday morning stage, carrying the wooden box wrapped in her spare shawl inside her carpet bag, and 2 letters of introduction that Harriet Yowell had written for her. One to a lawyer named Aldrich, who Harriet described as honest and sufficiently aggressive, and one to a woman who ran a boarding house on the east side of Tucson, where a traveling woman could stay without difficulty. Everett drove her to Gila Bend to meet the stage. They arrived early, which was his habit, and stood by the wagon in the thin, early morning cool while the town came slowly to life around them. He said, If Pruitt comes to the ranch while you are gone, I will not tell him where you are. She said, Good. He said, If the lawyer says the case is not strong enough to bring forward, come home and we will think of another way. She said, The case is strong enough. He said, I know. I wanted to say, come home, regardless. She looked at him. The morning light was the particular low gold of early autumn in the territory, and it caught the side of his face and the line of his jaw and the careful eyes that were, in this moment, less careful than usual, showing her something he had been keeping behind the wall of his ordinary expression. She said, I will be back in 4 days at most. He said, Flint will be insufferable the whole time. She said, Tell her I will bring her something from Tucson. He said, She is a dog. She said, She will understand the intention. The stage arrived. She picked up her bag. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her arm, not restraining, simply present, the gesture of a man who is not practiced at goodbyes and is doing what he can with what he has. She covered his hand with hers for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and climbed into the coach. She did not look back, not because she did not want to, but because looking back was the kind of thing you did when you were not sure you were coming home. And she was entirely sure. She was gone for 4 days. On the second day of her absence, Silas Pruitt came to the ranch. He rode up in the late afternoon with 2 men behind him that Everett did not recognize, ranch hands by their look, or men hired to look like ranch hands, which was a different thing. He dismounted with his customary ease and his customary expression of pleasant sociability and said, Calhoun, just passing through. Thought I might have a word. Everett came out of the barn and stood in the yard. He said, About what? Pruitt said, About the northern parcel. He smiled the smile that had nothing behind it. I heard you have been making inquiries. Land office, bank. He spread his hands. It is a small territory, Calhoun. People talk. He paused. I want you to know I am not here with any ill intent. I think there may have been some confusion about the paperwork on that amendment, and I believe we can resolve it simply if we talk it through. Everett looked at him. He looked at the 2 men behind him who had not dismounted and who were positioned with the specific casualness of men who have been placed where they are, rather than having simply stopped there. He said, My wife is handling the paperwork matters. Pruitt said, Yes, I heard she had an interest in the accounts. He paused again, the pause of a man feeling for the edge of something. Where is she today? Everett said, She is at the ranch. Pruitt looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked back at Everett. He said, Perhaps I should speak with her directly. Everett said, She is not available. A silence fell between them that had a different quality than the silences of ordinary conversation. Pruitt smiled again and said, "Calhoun, I want you to understand something. The northern parcel is registered. It is registered correctly and legally under a properly filed amendment. Whatever your wife thinks she has found in the paperwork, the legal record is what it is." He looked at the ranch again with his proprietary eyes. "I would genuinely like to resolve this without difficulty. There is a fair price on the table for the whole property. You could take that price, settle the loan, and start fresh somewhere without the weight of debt you are carrying." Everett looked at him for a long time. He said, "Get off my land." Pruitt held his gaze. The smile did not change. He said, "Think about it carefully, Calhoun. The bank's patience is not unlimited, and I have some influence over the timeline." He mounted with the ease of a man who is not finished and knows it. The two men behind him moved their horses back without being directed. Pruitt said, "My offer stands." Then he rode away down the road at the same leisurely pace as the first time, as though departure were something he was choosing as a courtesy, rather than because he had been told to go. Everett stood in the yard until the sound of the horses faded. Then he went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a house that usually contained two people and currently contained only one. He sat there for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the way it did when the house was empty of its usual activity, slower somehow, more present. He became aware of the small details Willa had introduced into the kitchen without his noticing the accumulation. A jar with dried grass and seed heads arranged in it, found somewhere on the property and brought in for their architectural interest. A folded cloth at the end of the table that had not been there before. Her 3 books on the shelf above the window, spines outward, the titles legible from where he sat. He looked at the books for a moment. They were not decorative. Their spines were worn in the specific way of books that have been read more than once. The corners softened. The covers faded at the edges. One was a medical text, which explained some of the knowledge she had deployed when Flint was bitten. One was a collection of essays he did not recognize. One was a novel whose title he could not make out from this distance. He got up and went closer to read the spine. It was a copy of Jane Eyre, published in London, the cover worn dark with use. He stood there looking at it for a moment. Then he went back to his chair. He thought about the letter she had taken to Tucson, the wooden box with its careful documentation, the notes she had made in her small, precise handwriting that he had seen spread across the desk on so many evenings over the past weeks. He thought about the way she had said, "I made it when I read the letter," when he had asked about her decision to go herself, meaning that she had read the situation clearly before he had, and had simply been waiting for him to catch up, not impatiently. She had not been impatient. She had been waiting the way she waited for most things, with the particular quality of attention that did not demand resolution but simply remained present until resolution arrived. He thought about what it meant that he had noticed the empty chair. He had lived alone in this house for 5 years. There had been periods, particularly in the first 2 winters, when the isolation had pressed against him in ways he had not anticipated, when the silence of the house had been less peaceful than oppressive, when he had found himself talking to his horse with more frequency than was strictly dignified simply to have something to respond to. He had worked through it. He had made his peace with solitude and had come, genuinely, to value its particular freedoms, the ability to set his own schedule and maintain his own silences without explanation or apology. And then Willa Ashford had arrived with 2 carpet bags and a stray dog and had proceeded to make herself, without drama or declaration, indispensable. Not because she had taken over, not because the house had become less his. It had become more itself, somehow, more the thing he had been trying to make it. She had seen, in the wildflowers he had put in a jar on the kitchen table, exactly what he had intended, and had said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not make it larger than he wanted it to be. And in that restraint, she had told him more about herself than any number of more direct communications could have managed. He sat with all of this for the duration of the afternoon, in the slow light of a house that was waiting for its other occupant to return. What Prairie had said about the bank's timeline, about influence over the patients of the institution, had confirmed what Willa had suspected about the relationship between the fraudulent amendment and the loan terms. If Prairie could accelerate the bank's demand for repayment, he could force a default before there was time to bring the legal case forward. The timeline was the weapon, and Prairie had just told him it was loaded. He thought about Willa in Tucson with the wooden box and the carefully ordered notes and the letters of introduction from Harriet Yowell. He thought about the way she had said, "I will be back in 4 days at most," with the certainty of someone who does not make statements she does not intend to keep. He got up and went to the barn and found Flint sitting in the aisle between the stalls with her heeling legs stretched out in front of her, and her eyes fixed on the barn door, with an expression that had not changed materially since Willa had left 2 days ago. He sat down on the hay bale beside her. He said, "She is coming back." Flint looked at him and then looked back at the door. He said, 4 days. Flint exhaled through her nose with the deep and pointed skepticism of a small dog who does not find this assurance sufficient. He stayed in the barn for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being in the space that smelled of hay and horse and the dry, clean cold of the coming autumn evening. Then he went in and made supper for himself and ate it at the kitchen table, and looked at the empty chair across from him and thought about what it meant that the empty chair was something he now noticed. The following morning, before he had finished his first cup of coffee, the Henley boy from the next property came riding up fast with a message that one of Everett's steers had gone through a weak section of the shared fence line overnight and was in the Henley pasture. Everett rode out to deal with it, leaving the ranch empty. When he came back 2 hours later, the gate to the south corral was open. He checked the corral and then rode the boundary and then came back and counted twice, and the number was the same both times. 11 steers where there had been 14. 3 animals gone through the open gate, which had been latched and which did not open on its own, which meant it had been opened. He sat on his horse in the south pasture and looked at the open gate and understood that the Henley boy's message had not been accidental, and that while he had been on the neighboring property retrieving 1 steer, 3 others had been taken from his own. He could not prove it. He could not ride to the Prairie property and accuse a man of theft without evidence, not in a territory where the accused man had influence at the bank and friends in positions he had not fully mapped. He had 3 fewer animals than he had that morning, and no way to demonstrate how they had left. Only the open gate and the timing and the thing Prairie had said about patience and its limits. He rode back to the house and unsaddled his horse and stood in the yard for a long time with his hand on the horse's neck, the animal standing quietly under the contact. He had built this ranch over 5 years with his own hands and his own work, and the kind of faith that is not optimism, but something more durable, the belief that effort applied honestly to honest ground will eventually produce something worth having. He had planted cottonwood trees for shade they would not give for a decade. He had written a careful letter to a matrimonial agency and been more honest in it than was probably strategically advisable. He had built a room with a latch on the door for a woman he had not yet met, and all of it, all 5 years of it, had been slowly worked against by a man with a silver watch chain and a proprietary gaze, and the patience of someone who has decided he will simply wait until the weight of what he has arranged becomes too much to carry. He went inside. He sat down in the chair at the kitchen table, his hat still on, his boots still carrying the dust of the south pasture. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He did not cry. He was not built for the particular release of tears in the way that some people are, the way that grief or anger finds its exit through that specific door. What happened instead was something more interior and harder to name, a kind of structural exhaustion, the feeling of a man who has been holding something up for a very long time and has suddenly become fully aware of the weight. He sat like that for a while. Then he heard the sound of a horse, and then the creak of wagon wheels, and he raised his head. Through the kitchen window he could see the road. Coming up it, in the slant light of the late afternoon, was the Gila Bend stage, which did not usually come this far up the ranch road, but which had apparently been persuaded to do so, because it stopped at the gate and a door opened and a woman climbed down carrying a carpet bag, and the stage turned around and went back down the road, and the woman came through the gate and up toward the house. He was at the door before she reached the porch. She stopped when she saw his face. She looked at him with those careful green eyes that took in everything and gave back only what she chose to give back. And she said, "What happened?" He said, "Pruitt came while you were gone." Then he said, "3 steers are gone from the south pasture." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her bag and said, "Come inside and sit down." He said, "I am already inside." She said, "Then sit down." He sat. She put the carpet bag on the table and opened it and took out the wooden box and set it beside the bag. And then she looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. And she said, "Aldrich took the case." He looked at her. She said, "He read the documents for 2 hours and asked me questions for another hour. And then he said, 'The date discrepancy alone constitutes sufficient grounds for a fraudulent filing claim. He has sent a formal notice to the land office requesting a hold on the amended registration pending review. Pruitt cannot sell or transfer the northern parcel while the hold is in place.'" Everett said nothing. She said, "It will take time. These things take time. But the hold is real, and the case is real, and Aldrich believes it is winnable." He looked at the wooden box on the table between them. He looked at her face. He said, "The steers." She said, "I know." She held his gaze steadily. "We cannot recover those tonight. But we have something now that he cannot undo quietly, and he knows it. Or he will know it when the notice arrives from the land office." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, brief and present and unperformed. She said, "You built something real here, Everett. The fact that someone spent 3 years trying to take it is not evidence that it was not worth building. It is evidence of the opposite." He turned his hand over under hers. He said, "You came back a day early." She said, "Aldrich finished faster than I expected, and I did not see the point in waiting." He said, "Flint will be pleased." She said, "Where is she?" He said, "Barn. She has not moved from the door in 2 days." Something crossed Willa's face, not quite a smile, but the thing that a smile comes from. She said, "I told you she would understand the intention." She stood and picked up the wooden box and carried it to the desk where it belonged and set it down with the particular finality of something being put in its proper place. She turned back to the kitchen. She looked at the empty stove and then at Everett still sitting at the table with the dust of the south pasture still on his boots. She said, "Have you eaten today?" He thought about it. He said, "This morning." She said, "Then let me make supper." She went to the stove the way she had gone to it on the first evening of her arrival, when the house had been strange and the man had been a stranger, and the only solid thing available was the work in front of her. The kitchen warmed around them the same way it had then, but nothing else was the same, and they both knew it. Everett took off his hat and set it on the table. He looked at the woman moving through his kitchen with the ease of someone who has learned the particular geography of a place and made it her own. He looked at the wooden box on the desk, at the documents Willa had gathered with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything, and he understood clearly what he had built here. Not only a ranch, something that required two people to stand properly. Something that had been standing incomplete without him fully knowing it. Until the morning a stage arrived from Yuma and a woman climbed down with 2 carpet bags and a dog that had chosen her. The hold on the amended registration arrived at the Gila Bend land office on a Thursday morning in late October, 3 weeks after Willa had returned from Tucson. Harriet Yowell told them about it before the official notice reached the ranch, because Harriet Yowell made it her business to know what arrived in Gila Bend before anyone else did, and because she had, over the preceding weeks, developed a specific interest in the progress of this particular matter. She came out to the ranch herself, which she did not do for just anyone, driving her own small buggy up the ranch road on a bright, cold morning, with her iron-gray hair pinned severely and her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for a specific outcome and has just received it. She sat at Willa's kitchen table and drank coffee and said, "Pruitt was in the land office when the notice came through." She paused for the effect she clearly intended. "He did not take it well," Willa said. "What did he do?" Harriet said, "Nothing he could do." He argued with the clerk for 20 minutes and then rode out. She set down her cup. "Henderson at the general store says Pruitt has been making inquiries about selling his own property. That is a man preparing to move, not preparing to fight." Everett was standing at the kitchen window. He said, "It is not over yet. The case still has to go through the territorial court." Harriet said, "Aldrich is a thorough man." She looked at Willa. "You chose well there." Willa said, "You recommended him." Harriet said, "I recommended him because I knew you would use him correctly. Not everyone does." She finished her coffee and stood with the efficiency of a woman who has more stops to make. She looked between them both and said, "You have done well, both of you." Then she put on her hat and drove back down the road. Everett turned from the window after her buggy had cleared the gate. He looked at Willa, who was clearing the cups from the table with her back to him, and said, "She approves of you." Willa said, "She approved of me in the first 10 minutes. I think she simply needed to see how things developed before she said so." He said, "She does not approve of most people." Willa set the cups in the basin and turned around. She said, "I know. She told me herself the second time I stopped at the boarding house. She said she had watched 3 mail-order brides come through Gila Bend in 5 years, and that 2 of them were back east within a season." He said, "And the third." Willa said, "She said the third one was miserable, but too stubborn to leave. which Harriet seemed to consider a qualified success. The near smile moved across his face, and this time it went a step further than it usually did, becoming something closer to an actual smile, brief and unguarded. And Willa looked at it and filed it carefully in the part of herself that kept the things worth keeping. Flint, who had been lying under the table in her preferred morning position, got up and pressed herself against Willa's ankle in the way she did when she sensed that the room had shifted towards something good. Her leg had healed clean, leaving only a small scar in the fur above the joint that you had to know to look for. She had lost none of her velocity or her confidence, and she had gained, if anything, a more pronounced sense of her own authority over the ranch's daily operations. Outside, the October light lay across the yard in long, clean lines, the cottonwoods gone gold at the edges, the desert air carrying the first real cold of autumn. The sky was the particular deep blue that appeared at this time of year, as though the heat of summer had been the thing softening it, and now, with the heat gone, it had contracted into something harder and more vivid. Willa looked at the yard through the kitchen window. She said, "I want to plant something along the south side of the house in the spring, something that will give color, not just shade." Everett said, "What kind of something?" She said, "I have been reading about what grows here. Desert willow, perhaps, or penstemon. Something that blooms." She paused. "I know it is not practical in the way the cottonwoods are practical." He said, "The cottonwoods were not entirely practical when I planted them either." He came to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the yard the way they had come to stand together at windows and on the porch, in the easy parallel of two people who have learned that proximity can be its own form of conversation. He said, "Plant what you want to plant." She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard, at the gold cottonwoods and the pale desert beyond, at the ranch he had built over 5 years with his hands and his patience, and the specific faith of a man who plants trees for future shade. His face in the morning light was the face she had come to know in the past 2 months. The careful jaw and the brown eyes and the economy of expression that she had learned to read the way you learn to read a landscape. Not at a glance, but over time. The details revealing themselves incrementally until suddenly you understand the whole of it. She said, "Everett." He turned to look at her. She said, "I came here to survive." She said it the way she had said it on the night they sat by the fire, watching over Flint directly, without performance, because that was the only way she knew how to say true things. "I came because I had run out of other options and I was tired, and I thought that useful work in an honest arrangement was the best I could hope for." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I stopped thinking of it that way some time ago. I am not sure exactly when. I think it was gradual." He was still. The particular stillness of a man who is listening with everything he has. She said, "I am not telling you this to ask for anything or to change what is already between us. I am telling you because I decided in Yuma that I was finished with indirection, and leaving this unsaid feels like a form of it." He said, "How long ago?" She said, "I think the night with Flint, or perhaps before that. It is difficult to trace exactly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told you, when we first talked about the arrangement, that I hoped it would become more than practical in time." She said, "You did." He said, "I want you to know that for me it became that considerably faster than I expected, and that I have not known what to do with that, because I am not a man who knows how to say these things without feeling that I am saying them wrong." She said, "You are not saying them wrong." He said, "I built this ranch because I wanted to build something that would last." He looked at her with the unguarded quality she had seen only a handful of times, the face behind the careful face, open in a way that cost him something. "I did not know until you came what I actually meant by that." She crossed the small distance between them and put her hand against his jaw. "The way you touch something you have been careful around and have finally decided to stop being careful around." He put his hand over hers, the rough, calloused palm warm against her fingers, and they stood like that in the October kitchen with the gold cottonwood light coming through the window and Flint sitting at their feet, looking up at them with the patient expression of a dog who has been waiting for this particular moment to arrive and is pleased that it finally has. He bent his head and kissed her, not the brief, careful kiss of their wedding day, but something with real intention behind it. The kiss of a man who has been waiting until he was sure, and is now sure. She kissed him back with the same certainty, her hand still against his jaw, the morning light around them, and it was not a dramatic thing, it was a quiet thing, the way the most true things often are. When they stepped back from each other, she looked at him and said, "I was going to say this, regardless of what you said." He said, "I know." She said, "I did not want it to depend on whether you said it first." He said, "I know that too." His hand was still holding hers. He looked down at their joined hands and then back at her face. He said, "I am glad you answered that letter." She said, "I am glad you wrote it honestly." He said, "I almost wrote a different version, one that made things sound better than they were." She said, "What stopped you?" He said, "I decided that if I was going to ask someone to come out here and share this life, I owed her the truth of it." He paused, and I thought, if I dressed it up and she came and then found out the truth, she would not trust anything else I said afterward, and I did not want to start that way. She said that was the right instinct. He said it was the only instinct I had that made sense. Outside, Flint had gone to the door and was asking with her nose against the wood to be let out into the yard, her morning patrol overdue by her estimation. Willa released Everett's hand and opened the door, and Flint went out into the October morning with the focused purpose of an animal that takes her responsibilities seriously. They stood in the open doorway together, watching her move through the yard, nose down, ears up, covering the ground in the efficient pattern she had developed over the past weeks. The barn first, then the corral, then the perimeter of the house, checking each fixed point against her internal map of how things should be. Everett said, "She is going to be an extraordinary dog." Willa said, "She already is." He said, "She found you." She said, "She chose me." There is a difference. He looked at her. She was watching Flint move through the yard in the morning light, her profile quiet and present. The bonnet she had worn when she arrived, long since abandoned in favor of a practical hat that had belonged to no one and had been hanging on a peg in the barn when she needed it. The gray wool traveling dress had given way to the calico work dress, and then to a second one she had made from fabric she had selected at the general store. She had put curtains in her room and a braided rug beside the bed, and 3 books on the shelf above the narrow window. She had put herself into this place, piece by piece, the way you put yourself into a place you intend to stay. He said, "I want to build an addition onto the house, before winter. A proper sitting room off the main room, with a window that faces west for the evening light." She turned to look at him. He said, You have been reading in the rocking chair by the stove because it is the only place in the house with enough light in the evenings. I noticed, she said. You noticed that. He said, I notice most things. I simply do not always say them. She looked at him for a moment with the green eyes that took in everything. Then she said, A west window would be good. She paused. Though I would also like a shelf. A proper one with enough room for more than 3 books. He said, I can build a shelf. She said, I know you can. The morning moved around them. Flint completed her circuit and came back to sit between them in the doorway, looking out at the yard with satisfaction. Her patrol complete, and the perimeter confirmed secure. The cottonwoods turned slowly in the light breeze. The desert beyond the fence line went on in every direction, enormous and honest, asking nothing of the people who lived in it except that they be equal to it. Willa thought about the woman who had sat in the stagecoach with a folded letter in her pocket and her hands in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has already done all the deciding that needs to be done. That woman had been right about one thing and wrong about another. She had been right that honest work in an honest arrangement was worth coming for. She had been wrong that it was the best she could hope for. She had not known then that hope was something that could be rebuilt, that it was not a fixed quantity you were born with and used up, but something that responded to conditions, that could lie dormant through a long Philadelphia winter, and then, given the right ground and enough honest light, put out new growth the way the desert did after rain, quietly and without announcement, and with a thoroughness that was almost startling. She thought about the letter that had started all of this, the one she had torn from the newspaper and kept in her pocket for 3 weeks before writing. She had kept it because she was not yet ready to commit to the idea it contained. She had written because she became, eventually, more afraid of remaining where she was than of the unknown quantity of where she might go. That was, she understood now, a different thing from courage. Courage was what Everett had shown when he had built this ranch from nothing in a place that offered no guarantees. Courage was what Flint had shown by walking up to a stranger outside a way station and deciding, without evidence beyond instinct, that this was the person worth following. What Willa had shown was something smaller and perhaps more honest than courage. She had simply reached the point where the cost of staying still exceeded the cost of movement. She had been exhausted enough and clear-eyed enough about her own exhaustion to step onto the stage, and the stage had brought her here. To this doorway, this morning, this man, this dog, this land that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She thought that the thing she had been most afraid of when she had sat in the Philadelphia room with the brick wall outside the window had not been poverty or hardship or even loneliness exactly. It had been the possibility that the person she had been before George's illness, before the debts, before the 14 months of careful invisibility in someone else's house, might not have survived all of it intact, that the surviving might have used her up entirely, leaving only the capacity for more surviving and nothing else. She had been wrong about that too. There was something here that she recognized as herself, perhaps more clearly than she had recognized it in years. The part that had organized the accounts of her father's dry goods store at 12 years old and found in the clean logic of numbers a kind of beauty. The part that had looked at a stray dog with showing ribs and thought, simply, I cannot leave it. The part that had read Everett's letter and recognized in its plain honesty not a lack of romance, but an excess of it, the most romantic thing possible being a man who tells you the truth about what he is asking before you agree to give it. The desert was warming as the sun climbed. The shadows of the cottonwoods shortened. Somewhere in the middle distance, a cactus wren was conducting its morning conversation with tremendous energy and complete confidence. Everett said, "I should go check the northern fence line today." She said, "I will come." He looked at her. She said, "I have been meaning to see the northern parcel properly, the one on the map. I want to know what we are fighting for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is a good piece of land. The creek runs most of the year. There are cottonwoods along it, bigger than these." He looked at the trees beside the house. They were there before I arrived. Old growth. He paused. The first time I saw them, I thought, someone planted those a long time ago. Someone wanted shade for a reason that mattered to them. She said, "Then it is worth having." He said, "Yes." He straightened in the doorway. That particular quality of resolution settling into his posture that she had come to recognize as him arriving at the end of a thought and acting on it. He said, "Aldrich's case will hold. And if it does not hold in the territorial court, we find another way. Pruitt has been waiting 3 years for this land. We can wait longer." She said, "We can." The word was simple, and she said it simply, but it carried the full weight of what it meant. The we, the plural that had not existed 2 months ago, and was now as natural as breathing. She looked at the yard she had come to know in 2 months, the cottonwood trees and the corral and the barn and the windmill turning slowly in the morning breeze. She looked at the man standing beside her in the open doorway of the house he had built with his own hands for a future he had not yet been able to imagine clearly. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers without looking down. The way you hold something you have stopped being afraid of losing because you have decided you will not lose it, which is a different thing from certainty and a better thing than certainty, because it is a choice made freshly each day rather than a fact that requires no maintenance. The October sun moved across the yard. Flint stood up and looked at both of them, and then walked out into the morning with the unhurried confidence of an animal who knows exactly where she belongs. Willa and Everett stood in the doorway of their ranch and watched her go.